Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil spent 20 years in the United States Air Force, and for a time during that period of service, he was also the executive officer for the Air Force Thunderbirds, based out of Las Vegas, Nevada. During his long and distinguished career, just to give you a little background, he also worked as the administrator of the Shuttle Challenger Commission. He also helped plot, we should say, plan maybe, might be the better way to put that, the inauguration, second Reagan Bush inauguration in 1985. And then after leaving the Air Force, he worked with the author Tom Clancy, planning a celebration to commemorate the 175th anniversary of the Battle of Fort McHenry outside of Baltimore. So we should point out he's got a long, long resume, and we're skipping probably about three-quarters of it this morning. But we're talking a little bit about airplanes. That is because yesterday I called him after getting news that one of the Air Force Thunderbirds actually had gone down at the Air Force Academy graduation, and we got off the telephone, and about 20 minutes later, he called me back, and he said, "You're not going to believe this," but he said, one of the jets flown by the Blue Angels is also down in Smyrna, Tennessee. It's 9:07, 67 right now at our studio. Bill Colley with you, too, as well, on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And Colonel, welcome back to the program.
My pleasure, as always.
I wanted to open up a little bit by asking if people are getting the message that perhaps these accidents are not so much random, but may have been expected because we have had so little money put into the demonstration teams over the course of the last 15 or 20 years.
Well, it is symptomatic of exactly that particular situation. The military, we've lost a B-52, several other F-18s off of North Carolina. We've had these two accidents all within the last 3 or 4 weeks, and it's just symptomatic of the fact that, well, there are two things that play here. One is an aging fleet of aircraft, and the second is reduced flight time and training because of the reduced military budget.
Some months ago, I was reading a biography of the great General Curtis LeMay, who, as I recall, you actually knew LeMay when you were a young officer. But I was reading that in the late 1950s, you had officers who were going before Congress, and they were claiming that equipment was outdated and that we weren't ready if we were going to get into a battle with the Soviet Union at the time. And it infuriated Dwight Eisenhower because he had served with most of these men before he was president. And he told one of his staffers, he said, these guys, they'd give up an entire brigade if I gave them an extra star on their shoulder. So sometimes when we hear people in the military say we need more, I think there's some skepticism that comes along with that. And we recently had testimony in Congress that we were not yet, we are unprepared right now if we end up in a big shooting war somewhere around the world. And so you may have doubts because of some past history, but I guess this is actually evidence that this time around, the Joint Chiefs are right.
Well, again, obviously that has been historically the case where you always need more or want more, but in this case, the next generation fighter, the F-35 is 37, is 6 years behind schedule as far as being combat ready and having all kinds of problems with it. They've spent so much money on it because it's such a sophisticated aircraft that they have had no money then to put towards the existing aircraft that are being overworked and overflown and in some cases extended well beyond their original obsolescence date, if you will. And these things the chickens are starting to come home to roost now.
Well, in mentioning that, we are seeing, I guess, what's playing out in this presidential election campaign, the real future of all of this, because we're so deeply in debt. And who was it? Was it Louis Zamperini, the World War II veteran and Olympian, when he died a couple of years ago? He was about 96 years old. He said because of the huge debts we had, we would not be able to maintain a military presence in the decades ahead, especially with the demands we've got from people who want more money for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, and the like. Are we looking at a steady decline here, or is there any possibility it could be reversed?
Well, I guess anything can be reversed, but something else has to give because, as we know, the, the well is dry. And if we continue to spend money on other areas, some part of the budget has to be reduced, and those monies dedicated towards rebuilding the military. And unfortunately, because it is so now diminished, if you will, it isn't going to happen overnight. And so every day we become a little more vulnerable, and that's not a good thing. And it is expensive to maintain a military, but in the long run, sometimes it's better to spend the money and continue with rather than go into a reduction mode as we have and always have, it seems.
Well, historically, I guess we could look back and look at 1939 and 1940 and say, we had, I think, the 19th largest military in the world. Even the Portuguese military was larger at the time. And we weren't prepared for what came, and it was quite a shock, obviously, and it required mobilization beyond anything we believed in at the time. But we don't even have a lot of those. There's no Rouge River plant anymore to manufacture all of these things as we had in 1941 through 1945. So if we don't have the material now and we end up in a big shooting war, my guess is we're not going to have it anytime soon.
Well, no, I mean, it really is. It's worse than is being portrayed in so many ways. And then the second element of this is that so many of our really good, experienced military members, and particularly pilots, are leaving because of what's going on. They spend. They're trained to go out and fight and drop bombs, shoot missiles, and do those things, and then they spend a week in sensitivity training because we can't be. We may have collateral damage if you drop a bomb in the wrong place, and part of another part of the deterioration of the aircraft, quite frankly, is over in the Mideast. A lot of these flights go out, fully loaded with all their ordnance, and they have specific targets that they are assigned, and they get within range and lock on, and then they get a call that says stand down because there may be a civilian in the immediate vicinity. And so they have to turn around, come back, and particularly for carrier landing, now they've still got all that heavy ordnance on board. And that makes the landing and stress on the aircraft even worse. And so that's where we are.
Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil. Well, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil is joining us this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and NewsRadio1310.com with Bill Colley. And, of course, we're coming up on 9/16 at 67. You mentioned that a lot of these people are leaving the military, and you've also mentioned to me in the past that it's very difficult any longer to recruit people to be a member of the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds.
Well, that is certainly true, and it's partly driven by the fact that it used to be that every fighter pilot wanted to be a Thunderbird or a Blue Angel, and now I'm going back to the '70s when I was on the team, the Thunderbird. we were just inundated with applications. It's quite a process, but the culture of both the teams has been so significantly changed over the years. Uh, Thunderbirds used to be a true fraternity. The current officers actually selected and made the decision and told the Air Force who they wanted on the team rather than the Air Force. In most cases, you get your orders and that's where you go. And for that reason, it just made more cohesiveness. But now that started to go by the wayside when the generals started assigning some people to the team, pilots who didn't want to be there, and that's taken its toll, and so many other things. So it's not just it's a combination of a deterioration in, perhaps you might say, the quality of the individual plus the deterioration of the aircraft they're flying.
We've got a couple of minutes until the break, and maybe you can stick around a few minutes following the break with us as well. The Tennessee story is the saddest, of course, obviously because the pilot was killed. But but when you come to Colorado Springs and they were doing a flyover for the graduation at the Air Force Academy, it was mentioned that following the ceremony that the president got an opportunity to speak with the pilot. The pilot did a remarkable job of not only ejecting from that jet, but he got it down in one piece on the ground too as well. I would still think that there's a great deal of talent that's available if we just would have the right equipment for these people.
Well, yeah, and I'm not disparaging the pilots in that sense. In this particular case with the Thunderbirds, he was part of the reason that landed intact is that, and I know you're coming up on a break. If you want me to continue this after the break, I have somewhat of an explanation of how that plane ended up whole on the ground, if you will.
We'll do that. We want to point out we've got a short break coming up. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil is joining us. He's retired from the U.S. Air Force and formerly the executive officer for the Air Force Thunderbirds, and we're discussing this morning the crashes yesterday, not only of a Thunderbird jet, but as well as a jet being flown by one of the Navy's Blue Angels, and both of these things happening just a matter of minutes apart from each other during the course of yesterday afternoon. We'll continue our conversation in just a couple of minutes on the other side of the break. It's 20 minutes after 9 o'clock in 67. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I guess the music is appropriate. Our guest is Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil. He is retired from the U.S. Air Force, and if you're just joining us, during his 20 years in the Air Force, he did spend some time as the executive officer with the Air Force Thunderbirds, and we're talking about yesterday's twin accidents involving one pilot with the Thunderbirds and one with the Navy's Blue Angels. 924, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, and it's 68. And Colonel, I was we were just before we went to the break, you were mentioning that there was a specific reason that after the crash in Colorado Springs that the Thunderbird pilot managed to leave that jet intact on the ground.
Well, and this is still obviously not official or very preliminary, but first of all, it was because he was on final approach. The pilot was not that high, if you will, and was traveling significantly slower than otherwise. But the plane didn't explode on impact, which gives you reason to believe that the reason that it crashed was because the engine completely failed. And so when it fails like that, it completely shuts down all the ignition, for the afterburner, and the engine itself shuts down. The fuel pump stopped pumping. And so that I saved it from that standpoint. So that's a fairly clear indication that something went wrong with the engine.
I was going to say that the difference too is that in Tennessee with the Blue Angels pilot, or aviator, I guess as they're called in the Navy, but what happened there is he was taking off versus trying to land.
Well, there's so many ironies here. First of all, uh, in this case, both the Thunderbird and Blue Angel, it was the number 6 pilot or the opposing solo uh, position. The Thunderbird crashed on approach to landing, and the Blue Angel crashed on takeoff. And so these may both be indicators of engine failure, and which is not good. It's two different types of aircraft, but yeah, I'm not sure it bodes well. And hopefully, I'm not correct in thinking this or being concerned that this could very much impact the teams going forward as far as their continued existence.
We could see, in fact, delays or perhaps even a moratorium on the rest of the summer tours, couldn't we?
Well, until they determine what the cause of the accident really is, they're not going to fly, and they'll have to then inspect particularly all the Thunderbird aircraft to determine whether the same situation is in the making with them as well. And so, yeah, they're going to stand down for some period of time, if not for the remainder of the season. That's in the hands of somebody else to decide, but that could be the case.
Got about a minute and a half left. The president obviously was glad that this fellow survived in Colorado Springs, and I'm sure that that
Mm-hmm.
was what the conversation was about. It probably wasn't a good place for politics, but I would bet that the people who are involved in the shows from the military standpoint would like to give him a piece of their minds when it comes to the fact that they are flying such outdated aircraft.
Well, there's no doubt of that, but as we know, the military is just that, and you you cope with what you have. You criticize and moan and groan in private, but the outside world, you keep your military face on and go forward as you're directed to do.
And I was going to say too as well that that when Donald Trump says he'd like to rebuild the military, that likely sounds great, but he still would have to deal with a Congress that has to make all of these difficult spending choices, even if he is elected.
Yeah, and like I say, he's not going to be rebuilt it as quickly as I'm sure he would like to do if he has that opportunity, because the money just isn't there. Um, that's the unfortunate part of the situation. I don't know that Congress is going to be willing to give up some of these other programs that the money would have to come from in order to do that.
Well, Colonel, we'd like to thank you much for your time this morning, and I hope you have a great weekend. And look forward to chatting with you sometime soon. I know you're still planning on coming out to this side of the country, and if you do, we might be able to get you in studio someday.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you behave yourself in Boise now.
Yes, I will. I will. I'm going to be just a bug on the wall this weekend.
Well, we'll just hope somebody doesn't have a fly swatter.
Yeah. All right. Take care, sir.
Okay, we'll see ya.
Thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil joining us this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. As mentioned, former executive officer with the Air Force Thunderbirds, reviewing the events of the last 24 hours with us. One more half hour of top story just ahead.